Hello, very beautiful community. Let me know if you can see and hear me. Then we're going to talk about the world. Good to see you, good to see you, good to see you, good to see you. Can you hear me? Can you see me? Can you hear me? Can you see me? Put it in the comments. Good, good. Looks all right. So beautiful community. We're going to do this all alone because Amalfitano, who is amazing at facilitating us, is not going to be here, which is going to mean that there's going to be enough danger in the comment section. It's going to be as dangerous as, for my UK viewers, the border of the Langley Massif and Iver Eve. There's a couple of guys here who are getting banned, and they keep changing accounts and changing accounts and changing accounts and coming back. One of them says that I'm faking my illness for profit, even though my illness, beautiful community, I'm in bed, I've got a problem, I'm stuck, I'm trying to pour a V60 into my coffee cup and I'm gonna spill it. No. Success, beautiful community. There we go. Never done this before like that. So people keep coming back and spamifying us. So some of them might be in the comment section. All right, let's rock and roll with questions. I'm going to be doing something special today, beautiful community, which is that I've said I'm not going to take questions left ahead of time. So we're going to be just taking questions as they come. We're going to revert back and forth because people love leaving questions ahead of time. It's just a wonderful way to make sure you get heard. But also some of you feel, right, we start and then for 40 minutes Vlad's answering questions that were left before. So we're going to do a bit of both. So hello everybody. So I'm just gonna look, beautiful community. Mr. Pink, are emotions such as anxiety and panic accessible to Trump? And I thought we were going to start with the Strait of Hormuz, with the Hungarian election. No, Trump's mental challenges. Are emotions such as anxiety and panic acceptable to Trump in bad situations? And also, what are the odds of him quitting NATO over the US losing the World Cup to a European team? Trump doesn't really care if the USA do well in the World Cup or not, in the sense of patriotism. So I kind of care maybe if England do well, although I love football too much, even though I don't get a chance to watch it for health reasons. But I watched about 50% of the Bayern Munich Real Madrid match, by the way, and I supported Bayern but expected Real to win, which is I think what would have happened had we not had a red card 5 minutes from time. But Trump couldn't give a hoot if this turns out well for America. He cares about himself. He has no sense of national pride or patriotism. The only kind of exception is New York. He thinks there's something magical about New York. He feels New York is a magical place. It's part of the reason it's been easier for Zoran to manipulate Trump, because Trump just has a magical sense of New York. He just thinks it's so amazing, and he loves being associated with New York in any way. But in the World Cup, it's me. It's going to be how much am I going to be on TV? Am I going to get associated with any awards? And it's me. It's just me. There is no America there for Trump in the World Cup. Does Trump feel anxiety? Shockingly little, because he doesn't hold any of the world. So Trump has no sense of his sense of self and no sense of the reality of other people. And even though he eats junk all the time, one of the reasons he is aging relatively well, we'll talk about that more. There's a lot of talk about Trump deteriorating, of course, and rightly so as well. But one of the reasons he's physically aging quite well, despite his terrible diet and not doing exercise, is that he doesn't carry stress. He doesn't give a hoot about Iran. He doesn't give a hoot about all of these people displaced in Lebanon. He doesn't give a hoot about Ukraine. He doesn't give a hoot about American citizens who can't afford groceries and so on. Because he doesn't hold the world, um, his level of stress and anxiety is way lower than Obama's would have been in office. Obama would be 10 times more stressed than Trump is, funnily enough. Trump can get angry, as he has done recently when things are not going his way, and he can engage in ludicrous attempts to compensate for a deficit of narcissistic supply, which he got for a few days from the Iran war, but not since. So that's my answer. Let's rock and roll. M is asking, what sort of pen brings you joy to use? So I love using very thick mechanical pencils that sometimes look like they're from the 1950s. So I'm a pencil guy. I'm not a pen guy. Are Iran's Lego videos good propaganda? Yeah, I think they've mobilized that messaging pretty effectively because it can tap into the United States looking absurd and impotent on the international stage. Emotionally, how should we feel about the success of Peter Maja and how it affects authoritarian trajectory? You should feel emotionally really good. It's good. So it's very important to celebrate good news and not just sink in corrosive cynicism. So it's terrific. It's terrific. Now you might say, but I've got that problem with him, I've got this problem with him, and there's all these problems his government is going to have, and then there's all these problems that Hungary has, and then there's problems the European Union has, and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, sure. But in politics, most people are advised, not all, but most people are advised to go for the better of two options. And right, this was like an ocean apart, the two options. So it's absolutely brilliant. It's good for Hungary. It's good for Ukraine. It's good for the European Union. It's bad for Trump and it's bad for Putin. So, absolutely, whatever it is you are up to, whether you enjoy wine, spirits, have a glass, enjoy yourself, celebrate. So, it's good for democracy. Here is what you don't want to think. You don't want to think that it fundamentally changes the pattern of democratic decline over the next 20 years. It doesn't fundamentally change that. You also don't want to think that this is some kind of victory for, um, let's say, center left liberalism. It isn't. It's a victory for a certain kind of mode of European conservatism. But it's the sentiments of European conservatism being mobilized in a much more constructive direction than Orban mobilized them in. The other thing, I mean, don't underestimate the Orban vote for all of the inappropriatenesses that were part of the election. There's quite a lot of folks voted for Orban, and because it's a significantly but not entirely majoritarian system in Hungary, um, there's going to be disproportionality between just the sheer number of votes cast and the number of seats available, right? So that can also make you sort of overestimate the crushing nature of the victory against Orban. But I don't advise any ambiguous emotion about this. It is great. It's terrific. You just avoid magical thinking that you can just get people mobilized and then all the social forces triggering authoritarian politics is going to be washed away. It doesn't work like that. Social forces of the kind we're dealing with are not wash awayable, right? They're there 20 years from now. Um, but I don't advise any ambiguous feeling. I think on balance is great, right? If you are a real identity, hyper identity politics player and you dislike all politics that's not yours, and let's say you're some kind of um, social democrat slash liberal, you're going to dislike Maja. You're going to dislike lots of aspects of his politics. But I don't recommend that way of approaching political events, because your question is, does this get me closer or further away from the kind of world I want? Or does it get me closer to the kind of world I don't want, and so on? In that sense, it's great news. So celebrate it. So, right? Let's drink to all Hungarians. Do I think the ceasefire in Lebanon will hold? Foggy is asking, because Iran has forced Trump to tie the reopening of the strait to the ceasefire. Over the next couple of months, whatever agreements hold and whatever new agreements are made with the hope that they hold, um, anticipate the challenge of the United States keeping Israel on board. Um, so there's all kinds of risk of Israel breaking commitments it has made and engaging in more violence. So we're always going to watch out for that, because Israel is simply not under the control of the Trump administration. If anything, it's gone the other way around in recent weeks. Gen Consensus is saying the World Cup could be ruined by Trump. It's a question for football fans all over the world who don't like Trump's politics and don't like what's happening with American domestic and foreign policy. What to do? Do you go? Do you not? Lots of people are debating that. Content view, practically speaking, for the UK, might we get to a place where we negate through the younger generations coming through and the older generations aging the rise of the far right? Could the destructive social forces then instead take a different shape? No. We're going to be hit by bigger waves of authoritarian politics in the 2030s in the UK. There is no doubt about it. And don't underestimate how much young people, and especially young men, feel like they want to give up on democracy. Elaine is asking, I'm Greek. Is it safe to go to Greece with all of the Iranian war going on? Yes. I'm jealous of you. I'd love to go to Greece. I go to Greece a lot. One of my two closest friends in the world, died prematurely. He was Greek man. He died 15 years ago. And so since then, as long as my health allowed, I go quite a lot to Greece, but I haven't gone, unfortunately, in about 6-7 years. But I wouldn't, if you were a loved one and you told me you're going to Greece tomorrow, I wouldn't bat an eyelid at all. If the US leaves NATO, is this going to be better or worse for the world? And could it create a more dangerous multipolar world? I think the way to think of um, um, I think the way to think of Western institutions is not in terms of collapse, but in terms of a kind of diminution, a kind of decline. That's how I think of NATO. That's how I think of the European Union. It's not that you're going to wake up, um, one Tuesday morning in 2034 and the European Union has collapsed. It's more that these are going to be alliances that are there, but they increasingly do, you know, less and less and less. So it's not that these are things that are just going to fall apart. They're things that are going to get stuck in the mud. So that's, I think, to a good extent, how I would um, think about that. Let me have a look. Does a person with a very big ego necessarily have NPD? No. If you mean, I mean, you can have a big ego unhealthily, by having more of a super ego than an ego, but you can have a big ego in a healthy way, and that's okay. Um, and even humble people in some special historical moments have big egos. For example, Schubert had a big enough ego to understand that he had something unique to offer as a composer that could stand alongside what Beethoven offered, and it didn't need to be in Beethoven's shadow. That is absolutely egomaniacal from some kind of naive perspective that doesn't understand that very often it is actually objective consciousness of one's powers that motivates great artists. Um, so there's plenty of healthy ways of having a big ego. I have a big ego when it comes to the philosophy that I'm not contributing to the world for health reasons. Did Robespierre betray his ideals? Well, that's a great question. Let me put it abstractly for us. A lot of the most liberty committed political enterprises in human history have actually had negative liberty promoting credentials in practice, right? That's the structure of how you'd handle that conversation. Oh, could spend a long time on it. Are we likely to see Alan is saying Article 5 essentially discredited, even with hundreds of US bases across Europe that they want to keep? So, Article 5 is already mostly gone, in my view. It's sort of carrying on by a kind of, residue energy. But without saying that Russia is going to invade the Baltics, if Russia were to invade the Baltics, don't expect the United States to come to the rescue there, um, even if NATO soldiers are attacked in the process. Um, so Article 5, of course, is also not as definite in what it says as most people assume. But putting that aside, Article 5 is, I think, mostly gone. So I would think of Article 5, and Putin thinks of Article 5 as something that largely doesn't exist anymore. But Putin understands that exposing very publicly its non existence could be politically advantageous. But Article 5 is not a meaningful security guarantee anymore. It just isn't. If you want to call that being a situation where NATO is dead, then that's what you call it. Let's take a few fan messages. How do you feel about the fact that women lead the biggest extreme right-wing movements in Germany, France, and Italy? Um, it's sometimes said that the most progressive countries on earth are led by women, and we get various examples. What I tend to say is that countries that are healthy can more often have women in power because they are healthy enough to allow women to come to power. I'm a very big fan of female leadership. I think I'm a bigger fan of female leadership than I am male leadership, all things put together. But we've also got to be realistic about the fact that that's how it works. That we have seen a few women leaders in relatively healthy polities recently, but that's not because women in power made them healthy. It's because they were healthy and therefore women could come to power. You can also be an unconstructive female politician. Um, so there's no paradox there, and there is going to be some rollback of women's rights over the next 20 years, but there's also still going to be some progression of women's rights over the next 20 years. The rollback is a shame. It needn't happen, but it's going to happen because of various regressive forces in our politics. But there's also still going to be a continuation of certain kinds of women's liberations being achieved, and even further perpetuation of it, which is good. It's not as good as it should be, but it's good. So there's nothing wrong, sort of, with the world if you're suddenly seeing female leaders who are unconstructive, or a blend of being constructive and unconstructive. A lot of them are very formidable, right? Um, you know, um, my partner hasn't been working as much in the last few years because she's had amazingly long COVID, but she's a journalist. She and I once asked her who is one of the most impressive people she's met, and she's met different kinds of people, world leaders. She actually said Marine Le Pen was one of the most impressive people she's met, um, almost putting her on the level of somebody like Tony Blair. So women's talent for politics is high, maybe slightly higher than men's, and it's going to be expressed in all kinds of ways, and many of them are going to be unconstructive. So that's life. Would you consider Putin a sociopath? Yeah, sure. Is he capable of empathy? Yeah, he is, but not that much. He's. It's better to say he is capable of. Chester is asking this question. He's capable of profound absence of empathy. Think of what he said about the submarine that sunk right at the beginning of his reign. Um, where steps weren't taken to rescue the sailors. Uh, what happened? He was asked on CNN with the submarine, and he said, it sunk. Can Orban's defeat be replicated in other countries? Mario is asking, yes, but what MAGA and his team did is quite amazing. It's quite amazing. So it required every lever available to you being pushed to win a game rigged against you. The question you're asking is really, at what point is it impossible to overthrow a regime? And the answer is actually that it's possible to overthrow a regime at a later stage in the advancement of authoritarianism than one might allow, right? But you've also got to be realistic about what your chances are. An extreme case is, could Putinism have been overthrown in the early 2010s? To which the answer is yes, but it's virtually no. But it's still just about yes. Can it be overthrown now? No. You need events to happen first before it can be overthrown. So you're basically doing this equation of institutional capture versus your capacity to effectively play the game even though it's rigged against you, right? So you can't go on the media, on the national media. You can't rely on the courts. You can't rely on all kinds of other institutions. So it's the extent of institutional capture, right, versus the impressiveness of the endeavor of the person trying to come through and defeat this institutional capture. MAGA's folks did it, but it required a lot. It required also some institutional pluralism. Don't underestimate how much it required people in a security state being disillusioned, people in the business elites being disillusioned. So you need a degree of pluralist conflict somehow within the system to tilt this. And that's why when you make these comparisons, you've got to make them historically accurate, right? You can't say, oh, the Ukrainians did it in 2014. Why can't the Russians do it in 2022? Well, if it were 2022, then no political culture could have overthrown that regime. So you see what I mean? You've got to be historically realistic about these gradations. What would happen in Canada if the US had a civil war? It's going to be outside my wheelhouse. And of course, there's many senses of civil war. And one could argue that in some lighter senses, the United States is already in a kind of latent civil war. So I don't know exactly what you mean. If you mean the breakup of the United States effectively, then of course that's going to pose enormous economic and security challenges to Canada. I don't know that I am a good person to begin mapping these scenarios for you. But I believe that the biggest threat in the United States is still authoritarian national government rather than the breakup of the country. Beautiful Adam Ragusa. Is it actually that bad to live in an empire in decline? Rome is still here. I've been, and it's nice. Rome is nice. Very polluted, but nice. London too. I suppose it wasn't good to live in Carthage at the end. Could we in the US view this period as a transition rather than a loss? So when you live in an empire in decline, like the United States is, one of the things that happens is that there is a loss of state capacity. So the government loses the capacity to do things effectively, good things or bad things. And that's a problem. It's a problem in domestic policy, and it's a problem in foreign policy. It's because of a decline in state capacity, in part, that the Iran war happened. Because the state couldn't facilitate a scenario where a decision could be made with all the relevant information there. Now, you might say that's a bit of a stupidly abstract description. It's just that Trump didn't want to listen to people and wanted to go in on instinct and trust Netanyahu. But that's an illustration of a failure of state capacity. So, uh, lots of bad shit is going to happen that is a product of the system not knowing what it's doing. Because it's such a complex system, you can have years and decades of pockets of competence within it, while other pockets are sort of ludicrously incompetent. So that's one element of it. Um, the bigger picture, however, is that it's very rare historically to have a constructive bit of imperial decline. Empires tend to not decline constructively. So, if the United States empire could collapse in the sense of the United States withdrawing its reach from much of the world, but keeping a relatively stable, high trust democracy at home, that would be absolutely wonderful. But you have imperial decline driven by democratic decline, and it's the democratic decline that we've got a problem with. So, democratic decline means we're losing trust, and we've got, as a result, a kind of a calamitous evacuation and transformation in our institutions. I'm saying our because this is happening everywhere. Now, because we have a bit of an imperial mindset in the UK, but we're not quite an empire, it's not breaking an empire that doesn't exist in this context. In the American context, if you think the American empire exists, then democratic decline is on course to break it or reset it. Um, so, and that's the problem you've got. Um, if you could paint a story of US imperial decline not triggered by democratic decline, then it could be constructive, but there's just no way that it can be constructive as it is. Now, I suppose the best picture you can paint is some kind of national democratic reset where the country stabilizes on a more harmonious politics 20, 30 years from now. Given the social forces out there, that's very unlikely. But that would be something more constructive, and perhaps to a degree you could call it a more constructive US withdrawal from the world. But even there, the trouble is that a lot of the world has depended on US projection of imperial power as a source of stability. It's also been an enormous source of instability. I mean, there are two very large scale events that we can associate with the trajectory of the collapse of the post World War II global order. One is Putin's invasion of Ukraine full scale, and the other is the Iraq War in 2003. So the United States has done a lot of unconstructive things, but it also has done constructive things, and including recently in Europe, in Ukraine, recently in Bosnia in the 90s. So um, this is some of how I'd process that, question. Um, because the cause is something toxic happening in your domestic politics, it's very hard to imagine it looking pretty. And the only way to make it more pretty is to challenge the consequences of these deleterious social forces that are deforming US politics domestically. So that's why I'm a pessimist, right? It's not good to live in a society in democratic decline, because all sorts of things that we deeply care about institutionally, but also at the level of values, begin to work less. It's not the case that in a relatively stable democracy you tell the truth and everybody believes you, but it's more the case in such a society than it is the case in a society that's suffered a kind of authoritarian collapse. You can say lots of truthful things, and the social power of your truthful claims is near zero. It can sometimes even be negative. In other words, the truer the thing you say, the less impact it's going to have, and the more pushback you're going to get. That's the sort of attack on some of the core values that we all share that's going to happen in a society in democratic decline. So, because we're not looking at, if you like, constructively mediated imperial diminution, I'm a pessimist, I'm afraid. Thank you so much, Adam. What do you think of the 1993 parliament crisis in Russia? What does it say about Yeltsin's credentials as someone who supposedly supports democracy? So, I strangely am more with Gorbachev than I am with Yeltsin. I'm not with Gorbachev in the sense that he didn't understand that nationalism was going to pull apart the Soviet Union. But I am with Gorbachev in the sense that he had a project. It's a project I don't necessarily agree with. I don't agree with it, in fact. But he had a certain kind of project. And his project was, let's keep democratizing. And eventually, what if we get something like a European Union on the ex-Soviet space, where we're going to have some distinctions between these countries, but there's going to be enormous structures of cooperation. So he imagined the European Union with much greater integration than the real European Union has on that space. That is a politicizing position. Yeltsin, on the other hand, had no project for Russia and very rapidly got caught up in authoritarian backsliding, the height of which is not the 1993 crisis, though that's important too. It's the 1996 presidential election, which was essentially rigged for Yeltsin. Rigged in the sense that everything was done to make sure that Mr. Zyuganov, the communist chap, was deprioritized. It's not that the election was rigged the way Putin rigs elections. He makes up lots of votes. It didn't happen. It's that it was rigged in terms of setting everything up to go against Zyuganov, and that's how Yeltsin squeezed over the line. Very, very damaging for Russia retrospectively. It was a sort of a radically undemocratic step that was done in the name of saving democracy. Well, look what happened afterwards. So, but Yeltsin is not Putin at all. Yeltsin genuinely had some democratic credentials. And he was genuinely appalled by Putin fairly early on. It's unimaginable what he would have thought of the later Putin. But the chaos of the imposition of this radical neoliberal ideology of Russia onto itself in the early 90s with Western help was a complete catastrophe and had a catastrophic effect on civic trust, the sort of thing you actually needed to keep a democracy together. And civic trust was already in trouble and it plummeted further. So Yeltsin's credentials as a democratic leader are pretty poor compared to many others. They're pretty amazing compared to Putin's. How can Christian conservatives in the US still claim to be Christian after Dr. Jesus lectured the Pope? Lots of love, dyslexic is asking. Don't underestimate how many people vote for Trump while understanding that he is a destructive entity who is going to do some things they like. He's also going to cause a mess. And given how things are going, a mess is something that they don't mind being caused. And there are even some destructive impulses in voters whereby they do want destruction as an end in itself. That also plays a part, don't underestimate it. But it's very important that many people who vote for Trump and loathe themselves for voting for Trump, but they still much prefer him to anybody else. But don't mistake how. Don't go around thinking that MAGA voters feel very clean about voting for Trump. They don't at all. And those who do, you would argue, are in a sort of a psychotic dynamic. There's plenty of those, some tens of millions of those. And the psychotic dynamic is just where you largely just evacuate contact with reality from your politics. You know, Trump said he is 11 feet tall. He's 11 feet tall. Measuring his height is neither here nor there anymore. Dear Vlad, if the world were in a better state, would you spend more time speaking on health and healthcare? No, because it's not my expertise. But if my health were better, I'd spend more time speaking about all kinds of different things, including health and healthcare. And that's obviously the case because I have very limited time. I'm working with 1 hour or 2 hours a day from bed. I'm coming up. Give me good health wishes, by the way, in the comments. I'm coming up to 1 year anniversary since I last stood up, even for 1 second. And today I made this coffee for myself, which I don't make every day, decaf, with my pour over. Did it from the wheelchair, and probably I could do 2 or 3 coffees like that on a good day. Obviously, I wouldn't. I'd use the energy for other purposes. But if we measure it in coffee making, I could make 2 or 3 coffees like that from the wheelchair on an okayish day, and that's it. So my wheelchair time is limited to just 1 or 2 hours. That's the reason why I don't talk about all kinds of things, but I'm trying to spread my wings out. Okay, let me just look at the live chat to see if I'm getting positive wishes, because I demand positive wishes for my health. 24th April is 1 year since I stood. Okay, let's finish the fan messages. Would a future US autocrat provide a more stable country for their citizenry than Trump does? Trump is a post-truth communicator and a post-truth actor. His actions are themselves untethered to real facts in the world. A future US autocrat is likely to be tethered to facts in the world, the way Trump isn't, but may well still be a post-truth communicator. That's a difference. A future autocrat would have checked if the Straits of Hormuz are going to be shut if they attack Iran. Trump didn't check that. So the problem with that is that somebody like that is going to be more skillful at accumulating power than Trump is. Trump is more beatable because of his all over the placeness with his narcissistic personality disorder. So the world will be more stable in some respect as we move into the age of less buffoonish authoritarians in the 2030s, but it'll also be worse in some respects. What you won't be able to get rid of is just this fluidity we've got, where international affairs are going to be dependent on the relationships between individual leaders of countries that are fleeting. That ain't going to change. We're going to have problems creating infrastructure on the international stage. But what will happen is that you're going to have leaders who are a little bit more in contact with various facts about the world, the way Orban was, for example, and Trump isn't. Quick rank of Soviet premiers. I like Khrushchev, but maybe that's because of the Death of Stalin film. I mean, Khrushchev was, in some respects, up to his neck in blood, but he is a progressive and reformist leader compared to Stalin. Can authoritarians thrive without work politics? Yes, absolutely. Look at 98%. Mick is asking, look at 98% of anti woke messages. Who is anti woke? Me. But look at 98% of anti woke messages online. They are actually anti democratic, they're anti inclusion, they're anti minorities messages. So woke largely at the moment is being, if you like, abused as an excuse for an authoritarian counter revolution against it. That's why it's so disgraceful for so many people who are still on the anti woke bandwagon to not qualify exactly what it is that they're doing. And that's why we do qualify on this channel what we're doing, because being non woke does not mean that we fail to recognize the authoritarian irresponsibility of the vast majority of the online anti woke brigade. Too big a question. Mika, why did liberal reforms work well in the post Soviet bloc countries but not in Russia? There are going to be explanations to do with political history. There's going to be explanations to do with political culture. There's going to be explanations to do with some semblance of democratic tradition in one's history. There are going to be explanations to do with what the West did in relation to these countries versus Russia. There are going to be explanations to do with Russian imperialism. And all of them are going to show that the democratic opportunity was available to Russia, but it was much more constrained in its availability. Having said this, we've just spent a long time talking about a Central European country that went a long way down the authoritarian loophole. Also, put this in the right historical context. It's not likely at all, but it's possible that Russia could be more democratic than Ukraine 50 years from now. Right. So a lot of these forces we're dealing with also should helpfully be thought about in the longer historical context. But this requires probably an episode in itself, which is why I've partly just evaded your question. Vlad, I struggle talking politics with my mum. She thinks everything that isn't her preferred pundit is liberal propaganda. How do I overcome this? You spend most of the time not talking about politics with your mum because it's very important for more things that you share to be positive rather than negative. So establish that. Then establish that you're interested in her perspective if you talk about politics rather than in persuading her. And she has to be reciprocally interested in your perspective rather than persuading you. If, on the other hand, her attitude is liberal propagandist, she isn't really having that much of a conversation with you, and therefore politics isn't an amazing topic for you to share in. But I would say first, intimacy around positive things, number one, over politics. And then within politics, focus on trying to have the most positive conversation you can, which is going to happen if you try to understand each other's position rather than try to persuade each other. So liberal propagandist, well, tell me what you mean. Like, how is he a liberal propagandist? What's a liberal propagandist? What's bad about being a liberal propagandist? What's liberal? What's a propagandist? Tell me what you think, mum. If we made every single person in the West watch your videos, would that reverse the democratic decline? Hussein is asking. No, it would be some kind of nightmare. But notice, even within our niche, the chat channel especially, which is almost designed not to grow, gets many fewer views than it would if I was more of a anti-Russia or pro-Ukraine activist, and then if I was more dramatically reactive to the latest calamity that Trump has got himself into. We're talking probably 5x views. So even within our niche, there's a reduced interest in people watching my videos, let alone in the global context. So yes, I'm wearing a public communication hat on, and yes, I am bad, but getting less bad at communicating effectively with the general audience. But I'm going to run aground if you try to put me through even adjacent algorithmic spaces, let alone if you try to pump me out to the whole population. So that's a slightly tongue-in-cheek answer, but that's all I can do. Who made the watercolor of the owl? There is a war correspondent called Anita McNaught, and this is just a card from her by an English artist wishing me health. So just put it on my bed. Thank you so much for the well wishes. If you were healthy, how much would me faking an illness make? It wouldn't really make anything. I mean, because my illness just stops me from working. So my illness is a catastrophic impact on my income because I work 1 or 2 hours a day. So what would I need to do? I'd need to fake working 1 or 2 hours a day from bed. I'm not sure that's a good plan. Talk about the open society versus the closed society, and talk about Karl Popper. Maybe we can talk about Popper on the Philosophy Channel. I knew very well Brian McGee, who was a friend of Popper's. What probability do you give for the energy crisis causing multiple zero-sum conflicts for competed resources worldwide? Content viewer. We are seeing this already. I want to detach my answer from the current crisis, actually. But we're going to see a new level of climate-mediated and resource finitude mediated conflict um, in the 21st century. By the middle of the century, you're going to be seeing, unfortunately, a lot more of it. And that's one of the things people don't understand about the climate crisis, how the climate crisis is an all issues crisis. It's a crisis that makes all things worse. It's going to create a shocking public health dimension with all kinds of um, diseases reappearing in parts of the world where they haven't been present. Um, it's going to trigger wars. Um, it's going to trigger migration flows of the kind we haven't seen in recent history. So the really challenging expression of that scenario is still a couple of decades away. Do you think Trump, Collective West, will go for Cuba next? Or move on to something else to get narcissistic supply? Trump needs something else after Iran. There's no question about it. What that can be, I don't know. Right? It's definitely not going to be enough for Melania to have a beautiful dress and for Trump to be impressed with it and stand next to her. He's going to need something more, because this sort of exponentially avaricious attitude, um, exponentially avaricious disposition toward narcissistic supply is something he's stuck with. Plus, with extra age-related dysregulation, he's going to need more stuff. Therefore, could Cuba be on the cards? Very plausibly indeed. Very plausibly indeed. Mario saying, what about the liberal turn of the Catholic Church on MAGA and Palestine? I used to think Christianity was predisposed to the far right. I don't think it is possible to make a generalization like that. It would be some really shoddy social science that got you to conclude that. You could get to all kinds of inclusive left politics from various Christian traditions too. What we want from a pope, more than anything else, always, is receptivity and inclusiveness, which we also had from the last pope, but not the one before. And that means you don't say this is the boundary of whether you're with us or against us, but rather that this is, it's always an exploration of who you can bring in, who you could include. So it's a position of that kind toward the world. That's very important. I also think it's very important to understand the various constraints that a pope is under when you look at the latest thing that's said and you're not happy about it. Just Denise saying most of Russia is without household water, without electricity. Is it mostly a third world country? No, that's not true, and it isn't. In many ways, Moscow, for example, which is absolutely not what the rest of the country is, but in many ways, Moscow is infrastructurally superior to many Western cities and very inferior in other dimensions. But Vlad, you have a balcony and you're planning getting some sunshine. So I had a very difficult month or two at the beginning of 2026 where I didn't see the sun for 30 days or so. For health reasons, I couldn't get onto my roof terrace. But now I can, but I mostly don't have time to. So I haven't gone on to my roof terrace properly for many, many days. And when I do, it's normally for 5 to 10 minutes because I have this problem with microvascular damage in my chest. That means that I have very limited vertical time. Coffee and Paul, thank you. Vlad, Fane, Julep is asking, I need understanding why this anti-democratic tide can't just be avoided. So, one way to be depoliticized is to think about politics without understanding the social forces and historical tendencies at work. So, to think that it can just be avoided, you need to think that all the people voting for authoritarian politics are just misinformed or ignorant or morally bankrupt. Now, you could say that at the dinner table, but you will be failed on an undergraduate sociology paper if you did that, if you said that, right? So why would you be failed? You'd be failed because there are all kinds of social forces conditioning what happens in our societies. And the question is, to what extent can you do something about these forces? And so the degree to which you can reverse democratic decline is the degree to which you can do something about these forces. The question is, how much can you do about them? And the answer is always some, but not beyond that some. Because one of the key things to ask when you think about politics is how far are we stuck where we are versus how far can we transform by our own action, by some degree of collective action, the situation we find ourselves in. And for somebody who is very non-political in the way they think about the world, it can be tempting to say, well, we can just wake up, change our mind, and then we're not stuck anymore. In other words, how stuck we are is just a matter of how stuck we think we are. And that's partly true. There is a lot of thinking it makes it so in the way politics works. But it's also not true. And the problem is that if you don't think we're stuck to any significant degree, you're actually functionally a Trump voter. In effect, you are so misguided about how to even begin thinking about politics that you're unlikely to be an effective citizen and unlikely to be an effective citizen who effectively opposes unconstructive politics. So, for reasons of quite objective circumstances, a lot of people feel that they have simply been left out by something like the forces of globalization. They feel that they're economically deprioritized. They feel they have no economic security, but they also feel they have no economic power in the sense that they can't inflect where they have been washed up by certain policies and by forces of globalization. So, with this level of economic exclusion, and then with the level of gross inequality of economic power, what are you going to do about that? How much can you do about it? You can't just fix that. We increasingly live in societies that are so atomized that it's very difficult for reasons of the way our interconnections in society work to get people convinced that they meaningfully share a society with everybody else in it in a way that has some kind of moral significance for them. What are you going to do about that? We've got this extraordinary proliferation of post-truth segmentation into distinct mental bubbles on the internet. What are you going to do about that? We've got the proliferation of ideologies of self-realization. Some of that's been expressed in what I've called hyper-identity politics, that make it very difficult to get people to think in terms of solidarity, in terms of um, public good. We've got some very natural limits to what a democratic government can do at all, because making change is really hard. A lot of these forces are trending in a more rather than a less challenging direction. What are you going to do about that? Will wake up and be in a different mood tomorrow doesn't answer to the problem. Would it have been less bad if Bernie Sanders beat Hillary in 2016 and therefore beat Trump? Yeah, it would. Would it have stopped democratic decline? No. What would have been the key takeaway of most of Bernie's supporters at the end of his first term? Disappointment about how handcuffed he was and how little he could achieve, and a sense of betrayal. What are you going to do to fix that? So it's very important that you can't attribute political events to simply a kind of aggregation of the intentional states of the individuals involved. That's a kind of sort of strange libertarian idealization out of reality of all of the real forces that drive politics. Of course, individuals make a big difference. Of course, the intentional states of individuals put together into a big pot can swing things dramatically in societies. But there are entire human fields of social understanding that give us an indication of, right, all kinds of tendencies that are difficult to control, right? And you have to work with these modes of explanation when you're trying to explain anything important, right? Why did the Nazis come to power? You need an enormous amount of social explanation to even begin to get serious about explaining that. And you can't just say it's because people woke up and suddenly they had that mood and then that they did this, or omitted an action that they could have engaged in to stop certain things from happening and so on. So the answer is social explanation is missing from your story about how something works that is mostly determined by factors that social explanation explains. There's a cartoon by Gary Larson with a field of sheep, and one of the sheep stands up and says, "But guys, do we have to be sheep? There are certain things that you can decide, but there are other things that you have to work with that you're stuck with." Joseph is saying Trump might have another go in Greenland. Don't forget that he's entirely capable of re-legislating that. One question, what I've had, as I've had over the years, what factors were present in the late 19th century and early 20th century which allowed society to overcome corruption and monarchism that are not here today? Um, all of the social forces that I've just named. This is way less reversible. than the authoritarianism of the middle 20th century. This is way less bad, the authoritarianism we're heading into, but it's way less reversible, despite what we've just seen in Hungary. So these folks 150 years back, let's be very cartoonish, needed to build certain things to achieve a certain kind of society. They needed to build independent and procedurally adequate civil services. They needed to make sure their courts worked properly. They needed to make sure that their various political institutions worked properly. On that story goes. Once they do that, there is nothing preventing them from then having a society which can constructively appeal to values like solidarity. We have positive social forces that are obstructing that. So it's really a story of the fact that they were gaining something nobody's ever had, and they had the capacity to attain it. But we have, for reasons of social forces, halfway lost that thing that they gained. And unless we remove these social forces, which we mostly can't do, we can't regain it. And that's why we're going to be in this guerrilla warfare, if you like, in our politics, where we do little piecemeal bits of democratic regeneration and then try to make sure our institutions hold. It's a terrific question. It requires it requires an episode of some length. Maybe we could do it. So if they did it, why can't we? Kind of question, and we could give a good answer to it. It's an important question. I also think a lot of people are wondering it, but the answer is partly tragic. D Shark, how much of your upbringing is your current view? Virtually none. I mean, if I stuck with the images, with the political images, what were the political images of my childhood? They were images about the utter calamity of the Soviet project. As a child, I romanticized even the other East European states like Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary were so exotic for me. The Baltics were a bit exotic. I spent summers of my childhood on the border of Latvia and Estonia very strongly. And there was this utter idealization of the West that bordered on even psychologically utopian thoughts about the West. Thoughts about the West that said, well, it's not only that they're wealthy there, it's that they're psychologically well adjusted and they don't even have the kinds of inner mental challenges and turmoil that people outside of the West have. I thought this as a sort of 6-7-year-old. And I was rapidly disappointed, moving to Israel out of the Soviet Union in 1990 and then to the UK in 1994. I realized, of course, that weren't true. The trip to Israel out of the Soviet Union was very, very, very magical for me. It was my first time, of course, leaving the Soviet Union. I'd been around a little bit. I'd been to Georgia, been to the Baltics, but it was all within the Soviet Union. It was utterly magical. It was a train to Budapest, and then an El Al Israeli Airlines flight to Tel Aviv. I think partly escorted by a fighter plane, and then seeing lights, because of course Soviet Russia was dark from the sky. from the ground. There were very few ads still. They were coming up, but there were not that many ads in 1990. And in 19 sort of 86, 87, it was really dark at night. It was just street lights and the lights from the windows of buildings. And so to see Tel Aviv so lit up, I'd never seen anything like it. It was extraordinary. And then there were hundreds of people, it seemed like, greeting the people coming out of the plane with presents, strangers giving you presents, a very un-Soviet thing. And then on my second day in Israel, I went to the market and I was picking up fruit off the floor. And suddenly people saw me doing that and started giving me free fruits and vegetables. And I couldn't imagine anything like that happening in the Soviet Union. Um, so that was a kind of a strange experiment in blood and belonging, which failed. But I'm sharing it in virtue of this sense of the idealization of the West that I had. Unfortunately, it is a little bit of what Ukrainians and the Russian opposition think about the West. Russian opposition worse, in fact, in their commitment to this delusional idea. They kind of stop thinking systematically about the West. They just think of it as the civilized world, which is precisely a view devoid of all of the social forces explanation we talked about. Which is why, if you ask a lot of the Russian oppositional figures, what do you want Russia to be like? They say, like the civilized world, which is a depoliticized statement. So that's the very antithesis of how I relate to the world, right? So my political views aren't at all constructed by that kind of magical thinking. But of course, I was caught up in that as a child. So that's a couple of cents on my thoughts about the difference between my outlook as an adult, my outlook as a child. Vlad, do you like Dr. Zhivago as a film, as a book? I haven't read it since childhood, so I don't have an objective assessment of it. I know that my hero Isaiah Berlin smuggled a copy of it into the West for translation, I think. Define woke, you're also asking, Daniel. So woke is a term, such questionable term, for hyperidentity politics. What is hyperidentity politics? It's when you take political disagreement, you make it moral. Then you take the moralization of the political disagreement and make it about identity. And then you expect institutions to take sides in that identity position and to inculcate it in future generations. So, one, from politics to morals. Two, from morals to identity. Three, from identity to institutional capture. Four, from institutional capture to the perpetuation of this capture for future generations. Or you could do it differently. You could say it's the stages of political disagreement as moral disagreement, political disagreement as moral disagreement, and identity. Identity as institutionally inculcated, identity as institutionally perpetuated into the future. So, I want to advance the cause of people living with my illness. We don't have anything like enough research to help people like me be better. So I engage in politics about that, and it's likely to be that the most effective way of engaging in politics about it is going to be without me moralizing and making it a matter of identity, that they should get the politics I want. I'm rather going to make arguments to do with some of the values we mentioned earlier, like solidarity, public good, and inclusion, for why me being omitted from, um, having a chance at a good life through lack of research is occurring. That's going to be more effective. Um, the nightmare calamity in which hyperidentity politics would land somebody like me would be to say something like, illness is not wrong. It's not a wrong way to be. It's just a different way of being. And don't make the mistake. A lot of US, especially disability advocates, have made that claim, which is insane. It's a sort of claim that says missing a leg is only bad in a society that normalizes having two legs. So Black Lives Matter is a good example of hyperidentity politics movement. It may have done some good at interpersonal reckonings with racism, but it wasn't cumulatively constructive, as you see from Trump being in power twice, at taking on racism at the level of national politics in the United States, because it didn't, among other things, it didn't appeal to these values that all citizens share in. I've just written a co-written piece on hyperidentity politics and climate advocacy. You can find on a link to it on the community wall on the chat channel. It's a co-written piece in resilience. So I do think I'll do a freestanding episode on wokeism, hyperidentity politics. The people who are good at discussing it are John Gray, Michael Ignatieff, and Mark Lillich has written a book about it, The Once and Future Liberal, it's called, in 2017. Why doesn't Adam Curtis come along? Because I've watched Adam Curtis's stuff ages ago, and I haven't rewatched it since because I live on 1 or 2 hours a day, and so I feel like I probably would need to refresh to have a fresher assessment of what I make of it. Is the Iran war over? No, I wouldn't think of it in quite such confident terms. Does left populism avoid the hyperidentity trap? It can do. It can do. So that's primarily because when you emphasize identity as much as hyperidentity politics does, that normal identity politics is fine. Normal identity politics is just politics. You can't take identity out of politics. But hyperidentity politics tends to omit one absolutely essential category. It's essential to the left, and that's class. And that's again one of my criticisms of BLM. Not enough class consciousness there. So, yeah, that's why I think hyperidentity politics is not left at all, actually, contrary to people who wrongly think that, like Jordan Peterson. Hyperidentity politics is a deformation of liberalism. And it's largely a politics of liberal elites competing for power and theatrically derived moral superiority. Mario is asking again, do you think the Israeli association with MAGA is reversible reputation-wise? Unlike the Democrats and youth will forget the Iran war and Gaza soon. Gaza is difficult because I think the Biden administration is caught up in that too. Vance is very unhappy about this, of course. Vance is very unhappy that Trump's got into this, that it turned out bad, like Vance probably expected. And I do agree that it is damaging for MAGA. I think we can also overstate how much anything could be damaging for a movement based on what I would call a kind of a psychotic evasion of reality. But yeah, it's damaging. Overall, what we could put together and think of as Trumpism is going to collapse. It's going to be replaced by other modes of authoritarian politics in the United States, but I'd say they're more likely to be discontinuous than continuous with Trumpism. Vlad, what do you think about the new internet phenomenon of Professor, who is a school teacher, Professor Jiang? Tsai TV is asking. Well, if you wanted to construct somebody who sort of reeks of untrustworthiness within the first 30 seconds of your encounter with them, that's Professor Jiang. I'll end up talking about his public communication because I'm being asked like 5 times a day. What I would say, however, is that he is an amazing content maker. He is an amazing content maker. Don't underestimate how good he is at that. But that is not intellectually good stuff. That's just making a product that's really good. I could be very evil at that. I could be really evil at that. If I tried to get up my views by persuasively saying things I don't think, wow, I'd be so dangerous because you'd believe me. Now, think of, for instance, all of that stuff in the pro-Ukrainian space that responsible commentators hate that talk about how Russia is going to collapse the next Tuesday. I could give such a persuasive account of how Russia is going to collapse next Tuesday that is completely out of the reach of anybody making such account, that it'll freak out even people like Mark Galeotti. They'll begin to say, well, I kind of think there's something to this. And I don't do that, but I could be extremely dangerous at that. But I try to not. I can package a thumbnail with the view of let's get people to watch the video as long as possible, but I don't want to package what I say that way at all. He's packaging it beautifully. It's all McDonald's stuff. It's just mass-produced, fake meat burgers coming out from his social media. But yeah, I'll be delighted to react to him at some point. Hey Vlad, how does a depoliticized citizen in Western Europe compare to a depoliticized citizen in the US and in Russia? Different. US and Russia are different. Ricardo, thank you for asking. There is more openness to unempirical, psychotic, magical thinking in the way the United States citizens are capable of thinking about politics. There's more room for crazy conspiratorial thought, more room for sort of quasi-religious, quasi-spiritual concoctions. So we're a bit more empirical. Doesn't mean we're nicer or better. We can also be very, very, very toxic in our slightly more empirical way. So I would say in the United States, there is more magical thinking and more room for magical thinking. In Russia, there's just deeper depoliticization. It's just inconceivably deep, the depoliticization in Russia. I mean, you've got the Russians having drones flying over their heads from Ukraine and still not thinking there is a war. You'd think there is a war if that were happening if you were in France or in the UK, even in the United States. So the depoliticization is more profound in Russia. The depth of the fatalism is more profound in Russia. Whereas the depoliticization is more psychotic in the United States. but it is equally consumerist probably in all three places. People consume politics like they consume various kinds of goods. Zhang predicted the Iran invasion 2 years ago amongst his other predictions. No, he didn't. No, he didn't. Um, Predicting something is contingent upon a causally accurate account of what's happening, right? Peter Zion couldn't have predicted Russia's invasion of Ukraine because his understanding of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, for example, is based on Russia's foreign security needs, Russia's national security needs, but it's largely a regime security war. So predicted is not said something is going to happen and it happens. Mearsheimer did not predict the Ukraine war. He said it would happen. If I predict that my cat, which I don't have a cat, I only ever had two pigs, but if I predict that my cat is going to jump over the fence today and go out and explore the street, for reasons that it's visiting my neighbor across the road, but in fact it's jumped over for a completely different reason. It's just made friends with another cat in another part of the block. Then I have said my cat will jump over the fence. My cat has jumped over the fence, but I didn't predict that my cat would jump over the fence. It has to be causally substantive, right? So a lot of you do this. Stop it. Stop it. A lot of you do this, right? Ricky 77743, my favorite expert, predicted that X would happen. Is Ricky's prediction causally substantive? Then Ricky predicted, right? So just saying some shit is going to happen, but not understanding the reasons for which it happens is not prediction. Rant over. You're unable to be evil, Vlad. Well, it's what Jordan Peterson likes to say about it, that a strong human being is somebody who is psychologically capable of doing evil, but psychologically not prepared to go there. I was meant to make a joke now, but I won't because we have integrity on this channel. Jordan Peterson is very sick at the moment, so we're not going to be making jokes at his expense. If he is back and he's healthy soon, healthier, we're going to make jokes at his expense. Do you think this turmoil we'll be living through? Cyber Samurai is asking, is worth it? This, given that a solution to the democratic crisis might emerge in the future. No, that's a redemptive narrative. It doesn't work like that. It's a redemptive narrative that still is tied to the idea that things will be better in the future. They won't. It's contingent that in some ways they'll be worse. What do you think of mandatory voting like in Australia? I like it. I think that mandatory voting is one of the big palette of options for countries that don't have it, that are struggling with their democracy, to consider. Why not be dangerous? Because I love you guys, and even if because you see, cumulatively, you guys want me to be way more irresponsible than I am. It's a bit unfair of this group because this is more of an inner group. You guys don't want me to be irresponsible as much as others. But especially when we go to, for instance, main channel videos, some of which have traveled through, 500,000 people, By that stage, half of the people watching want me to be way more irresponsible than I am and would watch more if I were, but I'm not going to do it, right? Your internet is full of people saying stuff about how the Putin regime is collapsing who have not the faintest idea of how to even begin analyzing Russia, just to take one example. Also, right, look at what I say about Trump. Narcissism plus neurodiversity plus a bit of decline. It would be so much more popular if I said dementia. I'd get so many more views. Nobody knows what the hell I'm talking about when I talk about ADHD, right? So, but I'm gonna do it. Um, by the way, some of you are asking me when the Israel video will be. Because of my health being so limited, I've made a commitment to myself that I'll do it as soon as I release my next main channel video, whenever that'll happen. I hope that happens in the next few days. It's been impossible to get it out because I have so little time. But once I get that main channel video, I'll get the Israel stuff out. How bad is the damage Ukraine can do to Russian oil economy, production, exports? So the problem that Ukraine is facing is that Russia can repair and reconstitute. And the problem Ukraine has been facing is a lack of capacity to hit and then hit again and hit again and hit again. Um, that, though, is for military experts to analyze properly. What I can say is that currently Ukraine does not have a capacity to hit Russia in a way that would get Russia anywhere near reconsidering whether it should continue its war. Will there be democratic movements anti-democratic movements on the left in the future? Content viewers asking. Yes, but the key wave coming our way is right authoritarianism or ex-conservative, ex-right authoritarianism. That's the main threat. It's not going to change to left by the 2030s. It's going to be a right or ex-right. If I'm curious, if you were to be self-critical, what would you say your overlooked areas are? Daniel is asking. Well, I mean, that could be about what I'm doing procedurally as a baby public intellectual and what I could do better. So that's obviously one way to think about it, procedure. That's how I think about it. Are there parts of the world I'm not talking about enough? Yeah. But I'm not stopping doing that for any kind of particular reason except just health and limitation of my resources. So in terms of my coverage, health is a huge factor. And then the other thing that I could improve is just my quality as a minor public intellectual, which I give myself a score of about 5.5 out of 10, maybe. And I would have been about a 3 a few years ago as a public intellectual. So I've made good progress, but there's no reason not to get to 7. Yeah, Pauli, you're making a correction of what I've said on oil in Russia and Russia's capacity to carry on the war. There's nothing you know that I wouldn't, right? So just think about that. The difference is that you know the basic economic facts, but you have no idea how they apply to the perpetuation, stability, and approach of the regime. So humility. Fat Bonsai, if you allow me to friendly challenge, your analysis of Trump's actions is so strongly based on NPD and ADHD. Do you think it's a weakness of your analysis? You can't directly confirm this. Well, If he has both, then it's a weakness of any analysis not to emphasize these things. It's not as though these things can be equivalently captured through another explanatory prism. They can't. First point. Second point, question of you can't directly confirm this. That's an evasion, right? Can one give a remote diagnosis to somebody? No, of course not. Can one make a claim in a demonstrable way such that anybody encountering the claim would agree with it? No, but that's not true of virtually anything except the most glaring matters of fact. And even those you can't get assent for. So that's all a version of normal, right? You can't demonstrate something like that and blast people into seeing it. Nor can you offer a remote diagnosis to anybody. But what you can do is say with confidence that it's the case. And if your question is about that confidence, then my confidence is 100%. It's not 99. If I were 99, I actually wouldn't be pushing it that hard. It's because it's obviously true to me, not as in to me from my perspective, but because I can see that it's obviously true, that I am speaking about it. If I were at 95, it would be unethical, completely unethical for me to say what I'm saying. I'd start saying things like, it's important that we consider the possibility that, even if I were 95% confident, I wouldn't be saying it. Even 99 is not sufficient for me to be using the speech I've been using. I would be a little bit hubristic, a little bit insufficiently skeptical. So you've got to tell apart whether you can definitely see something, whether you can establish some kind of diagnosis remotely, which you can't, because obvious reasons. We're not a psychiatrist, and Trump's not in our office. And 3, can you demonstrate? Well, I can demonstrate very little. Most of the interesting things we can say are not things that we can sort of blast everybody who is a reasonable interlocutor into agreeing with. And this is difficult because it's not just that most people, can't agree or disagree with me when I say it, is that most people don't have the resources to agree or disagree with me about it. On narcissism, I think most just about do. On neurodiversity, it's harder. You have to really have encountered it a lot in your life. So yeah, that's a huge own goal, and this goes hugely against my interests for the evil kind of interest that we mentioned earlier of getting more views and so on. Well, not evil, but getting more views by BSing is minorly evil. But it would be much easier for me to not mention that. If I was strategic, let me put it like this. If somebody said, Vlad, make the strongest impact on the biggest number of people in your Trump analysis, or we are going to unalive everybody you love, if aliens came and said that, then I'd be choosing between integrity or losing all my loved ones or saving them. I'd have to save them, I suppose. And therefore, I'd not mention the particular bits of my analysis of Trump because it's a big own goal to mention them, but it's true, so I have to. Did Epstein scandal make you reconsider your priors on Me Too? I used to dismiss his work nonsense. No, you haven't understood. You haven't understood. Mario, what I said about BLM earlier is compatible with it being true, as I believe it is true, that there is deep racism in the United States, and there is deep structural deprioritization of Black people. So the tenets of what's wrong that BLM starts with, I roughly share. It becomes hyperidentity politics when it engages essentially in somewhat theatrical cultural discourse and loses sight of political efficacy. Right? So it's not that I'm questioning the end, I'm questioning the pursuit of the end. So I'm a big feminist. I think that the world is hugely set up still against women. I think we are hugely prejudiced about women's experience still. I think I have a freedom to do all kinds of things that a white woman in my place would not have the freedom to do in the social world. Where the hyper-identity politics would have kicked in with Me Too is, for instance, in believe me, rather than listen to me, take my story seriously, and go out of your way to damn well check in detail whether my story is true or not. That's politics. Believe me, because of who I am, is hyper-identity politics. Right? So, no, I'm not Noam Chomsky, who just thought that he didn't even think that. Noam says in the Epstein files that it was a bit of hysteria. Actually, let's keep Noam out of it because he also did understand the disadvantage women face. But yeah, so that's the story. Me Too had elements of hyper ID, but it also was legit. Like, we have got a lot of men in power, a lot of men recently out of power who've done terrible things. And it's still pretty normalized, right? There's a lot of people, a lot of political actors to whom you'd have a fairly favorable disposition or a semi-favorable disposition who did terrible things. And we're still semi-okay with it. So no. What I'd also not be impressed with is the situation of people going too far to just associate their entire political identity with a movement like Me Too. So, but the points about the disadvantage of women, I start with myself in the support. Daniel, thank you. Let's have a look. Since Marrow is asking, it would be good to have a look at Vlad's really evil messaging about Russia's collapse. Yeah, I could do it for fun at some point. It would be the sort of thing that Hamish, De Brito, and Gordon would like to do, but can't because he doesn't know enough about Russia. Does social media encourage recklessness and extremism to get views, which can turn into a cycle of mutual escalatory sort of dynamic between creator and audience? Yes. Yes. So I am hugely motivated by the algorithm to say that Trump has got dementia, has gone mental, and that it's over for him. I'm hugely motivated by the algorithm to say that it's over for Putin. And I'm hugely motivated to say in every thumbnail that Ukraine has got some kind of new dimension of success against Russia. You won't believe how this is nearly the final thing, right? You've got content creators who are saying that in every thumbnail for years, even though it's a short-term collapse message, that they're managing it all the way through. And why is that? It's because you guys are mostly okay with it. Less so this particular restricted audience. We're only 600 in this room. But as I say, if we broaden out a lot, we deal in the hundreds of thousands that have watched some of my main channel videos. A big proportion of these people is ready to fall over and over and over and over for the thing that, that keeps not happening but being announced. and that you just fall for it the way you fall for getting stuck in an algorithm and enjoying, I don't know, cupcake videos, or enjoying female nudity, or enjoying um, some kind of put downs of people in the culture you don't like, or enjoying, I don't know, fights. Um, so you just log on. Wow, Putin's collapsing. Great, great. Have I been told that he's collapsing 600 times in a row every day? Yes, but am I going to click on it? Yes, yes. It's a kind of gamification. It's almost like, well, I've lost the last 20 times I've gambled, but I'm going to gamble again. So it's hugely, right, compelling for me to do this. Even within the vantage point of the limitation of my illness, I could get my main channel to 500,000 subscribers very quickly if I did that. Um, and this channel as well. But then think about it like this. It's not just that I physically can't do it because it goes against everything that I am. It's also that, where are these people going to be 10 years from now? So what if you've got 1 million views on something that you've been saying every day 600 times, even though it doesn't happen, right? By that time, you see it's not necessarily such an apocalyptic advantage to build that kind of audience. But even that's questionable. Even that's questionable. So I'm myself probably on balance doubtful of the thought, if you work like that, it's not going to work out for you in the long term. I think it probably will. I think if you're manipulative, I think it does work out for you in the long term on balance. It is more advantageous financially, and it is more advantageous in terms of eyeballs. So there isn't going to be a sort of um, you know, a restoration of justice by the world later. I think you just will be successful, and then what you'll actually be able to do is just quit doing the irresponsible thing that got you big and start being more responsible, if you like. Right? There's also that kind of incentive. So yes, the incentive situation is completely messed up on social media, and it creates a sort of a toxic dynamic of co-option between viewers and content creators. Mario is saying Mamdani is not running on a identity politics platform. Well, don't forget, white people are more into hyper identity politics than any minority, right? Hyperidentity politics is in good part a way of white people elevating themselves in their perceived moral status within certain elite institutions. No, race is not the only identity you can have. You can have all kinds of identities. You can have an identity that's very important for us to have, and that's being a citizen in the country you're at. You can have all kinds of other identities. I have an identity as a philosopher. Would I agree to be interviewed on the rest of Is Politics about Trump? Yes, absolutely. No, it's not hyper identity politics just if you say I'm an X in politics. It's that you say I'm an X, and I'm an X takes a kind of strange centrality that is more cultural than political. Why do so many people make so many incorrect predictions and get away with it later on? Um, because once you're on the expert circuit, for example, it's very difficult to be kicked off. And it's quite easy to migrate from one circuit to another. Um, so that's important. Also, um, algorithmic bubbles mean that if you've got your people, whatever ideological rendezvous you take, prediction rendezvous you take. A lot of thoughts about channels and viewers. The biggest thing that I personally recommend is when a content creator, if they're political, less necessary if they're an activist, but if they're really an analyst, or if they're really just exploring the world with you, um, it's good to have an ongoing conversation of trust about what trust is between the two parties. It's helpful. And I recommend it. And that's why I always do that with you. Is objectifying women by heterosexual men presumably biological? Jazz Denise asking. Yes, it's not just um, a, a cultural particularity. So it's about not repressing that instinct in heterosexual men, but creating a society in which it is constructively rather than unconstructively expressed. Somebody's asking me about Dmitry Gordon. You know what he is? He's done all kinds of funny stuff, including selling healing pyramids. But what is he is the best interviewer on the ex-Soviet space, the best long format one-on-one interview on the ex-Soviet space. Empress says, honestly, I sometimes don't even listen to you. I just kind of absorb your vibes. It's enough to stabilize me. If you were telling more grifty stuff, I think my vibe wouldn't appeal to me anymore. Well, it's always very important that you keep cultivating your vibes so that they are more objective, right? That's important. So that if you get a bad vibe from somebody, it's not just because it's a bad feeling, it's because you're training yourself to feel proportionately in response to content you encounter. That's important. The other thing is that when you do this job that I'm doing now with you, beautiful community, it's amazing how little I get to control what kind of positive impact I make. And it's very important that you don't try to be a control freak about it, right? And it genuinely happens to me a lot. I get a lot of correspondence like that. That's, you put on a meal, you have 3 courses, and somebody writes you a letter saying, Vlad, thank you so much for the meal because the napkins were just amazing. And if you are a control freak as a public intellectual, you'd be tempted to say, no, 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 it's not the napkins. It's like the meal. I did the 3 courses, and the point was that like the 3 courses were going to be the thing that you have, and that's going to maybe do something for you, change your relationship with food, or maybe you'll cook some of the things you've eaten. It's going to be great. Nah, I like the napkins. And it's very important to not feel that that's wrong because you understand the uncontrollability and also the serendipitous nature of this exchange, right? You are endlessly surprised about the impact you have on people. This is the opposite of how I'd engage as an intellectual. If I'm in a philosophy seminar and some professor of philosophy has taken the fluff of my argument instead of the substance of it and has assume that's my main point, I would say, no, you have mischaracterized what I've said. You've not received it appropriately. But there is not the same space to say in this kind of dynamic that we have, no, you haven't received it appropriately. And I don't try to, because I'm doing different things at the same time and I'm having multi multifaceted kinds of impacts. For some of you, I'm keeping you sane. For others of you, I'm giving you some useful thoughts. For others, I'm some kind of background. For others, I'm like life changing. I've completely changed how you relate to the political world and to yourself. That's like for 0.01% of people. So it's all different. For somebody else, I'm just a model of how to combine toughness in the view you express with warmth and gentleness and some generosity. So you're not just mean to everyone, but you're also not fluffy. So it's very different. Um, the impact you have on different people, and the most important thing, I don't control it. And what I really enjoy, there's a lot I enjoy about this work that I'm doing, but one of the things I enjoy is I don't want to control it. There's no part of me that thinks, right? So, for example, notice that I go up and down when people ask me, Vlad, is democratic decline real? Maybe it's not real, maybe it's just reversible. I go up and down. I'm sometimes tough, I'm sometimes soft, but I never have the feeling, oh my God, why don't they understand it? I've said it 700 times and they don't understand it. It's not my job to make you understand what I've said. And it's not my job to make you agree with me, which would be disaster if everybody here agreed with me about everything. Because it would mean you're not arriving with an individual organicity to your own views. So I might be sometimes twisting that gear, and sometimes I'm really tough on people who say, "Boom, democratic decline is fake," and I say, "Boom, it's real." But I don't do that because I have some kind of frustration that like 30% of people are not understanding what I'm saying or what I mean by social forces. Um, I, I just don't know. I don't even know what it would mean to feel that. I'm putting it out there, but I don't know what it would mean to control whether you eat it or enjoy it. I don't want to control that. That would be weird. And so the fact that I have no frustration around that is one of the things that makes this very, very free for me and very enjoyable. Um, and I think probably a younger version of me 15 years ago, would have wanted more control. Okay, a few more and then we'll scale down. Hypothetical scenario, Lucas. Putin disappears out of natural causes tomorrow. Um, what does next week look like for Russia with two Z's? I don't like the two Z's, as you know. It's sort of obstructive of thought. I think it's a little bit too much of a thought evacuating label. So Russia would finally be in a position to stop the war, because when Putin began the full-scale invasion in 2022, not a single person I can think of on his Security Council would have thought that was a good idea. Not one. Not even Patrushev, the hawk of hawks. Some people in Putin's circle may have thought that, but nobody in his Security Council. So what we would then have is a possibility to engage in the kind of compromise we can't engage in with Russia at the moment, because Putin is not open to compromising. Much of the regime would like that if that happened to Putin, but also would be very scared of it, because who's going to protect their butts? Who's going to protect their resources? And then the most likely scenario would be a little bit of a little bit of collective rule, or somebody who is perceived to be weaker, like Gorbachev was perceived and Khrushchev was perceived, being pushed to manage the situation. So that's the beginning of a conversation in answer to that. Do you have thoughts on people using AI to check fact claims? It's a new phenomena, but it'll get to a point where it's ubiquitous. Even Googling something will give you an AI summary now. So I am okay with that as long as you understand that it's going to hallucinate some of the time, right? ChatGPT a few weeks ago told me that one of my favorite philosophers wrote a book they didn't write and gave me lots of quotes from it. So you've got to understand that it could be wrong, and you've got to ask it for evidence that you then have to check, right? So you can't just ask it. If you're doing something really proper, you have to double check. If I'm dealing with something that I don't know directly myself and I'm asking AI about it, let's say for a main channel video, I'll go through to the links. I won't just rely on the AI. But there's an interesting way in which interaction with these things is restructuring the way we think, the way we form sentences. We'll talk about that another time, I'm sure. Deb is saying, unfortunately, predictions are never tracked as to whether they materialized. I think we should have some kind of impartial service where we have prediction, reason for the prediction, and then event, and then, I don't know, the status of opinion among the relevant expert community on the causes of that event. And that will create some problems for people. Unfortunately, I'm not big on that. I'm not big on saying, oh, you're not serious enough, you shouldn't be in the public space. I'm really open and I'm a real pluralist about people being in a public space with all kinds of mixed motives, because humans are what they are. So I'm not a perfectionist about this. I don't want to ban everybody from the public space who is irresponsible. Do you think comedians have an important role in politics? Yeah. I mean, look, for example, at the MAGA ecosystem. The people who are beginning to question it, the public platform people who were MAGA adjacent for Trump's second election, who among them are beginning to question them first? Well, it could be that it's Tim Dillon. Is that his name? I'm so sorry. I've got brain fog. Let me just check. Yeah, brain fog. I've listened to several hours of his stuff, so it is Tim Dillon. Yeah, Tim Dillon is questioning Trump more than other people with platforms adjacent to the Trumposphere before the election. So, comedy is very important politically, but also, of course, comedy is very important non-politically. It's a very important part of culture. Why do you think the personal tragedies of war, like injury and death and loss of relatives, get overshadowed by larger political and economic factors, like we're just glazing over the realities of war? Well, it's a bit of both. I do think that there's quite a bit of reality of war voyeurism that the news cycle encourages and the instantaneous gratification social media cycle encourages, whereby people don't want to understand the big picture, they just want the latest hit. And then I'd say that casualties really only matter if they are experienced by people like you. So we massively deprioritize casualties, victims of various human calamities, um, who are not like us. That's why, even though there is a deficit for civilian casualties in Ukraine and the West, there's much greater sympathy for Ukrainians because they're considered either European or proximate to Europe. So that's a very important thing. Um, there is also something else. There's a limit to how much your sort of ethical economy in your head can sustain. You can't engage in more than a couple of percent of the suffering that's going on in the world without it being sort of intolerable if you're an average human being. Content view. Do you honestly think a person like Konstantin Kisin is any more responsible or honest or moral than a person like Tucker Carlson? So I like that question. It's a little bit too provocative. It's a little bit like trying to make a point against me. Doesn't impress me. Yes, Konstantin Kisin's main problem is that he's just not a natural thinker about politics. But there's no comparison in levels of entrepreneurial manipulation between him and Tucker Carlson, in my view. Tucker is much more self-consciously uh, an entrepreneur of currents floating around. So yes, there's quite a big gap there. Okay, let's do a couple of more or so. Hey Vlad, David is asking, who should I go to if I want to be exposed to elaborations on the ideas you use to interpret the world? Well, it depends on what kind of ideas. I mean, there's a statement of the history of political thought that inspires me on the philosophy channel. It might be something like, what is Vlad's ideology? And there you can sort of reconstruct for yourself where I come from. There are certain particular figures I greatly admire, like Hobbes and Machiavelli. In moral philosophy, I am in many ways a Nietzschean. My two recent moral philosophy heroes are Richard Wolheim and Bernard Williams. A big part of my politics is realism, not the international relations type realism, but a kind of realism that takes the political in politics seriously. So in political writing, I have quite a lot in common with Bernard Williams, who has a collection of political writings called "In the Beginning Was the Deed," a posthumous one published a couple of years after he died in 2003. I am, to a degree, close to a lot of the great social and political philosophers. of the West, but that's all over the place, from Mill to Marx. So, and with some of these great figures, it's meaningless to ask whether you're in favor or against them. They're just there. They're part of framing and understanding of where we've come from, who we are, and where we're going. Outside of politics, if you wanted to deepen the your sense of some of the psychoanalytic remarks I make, but this is myself exploring something. I'm not an expert on psychoanalytic thought at all. I am an expert on political philosophy and political theory. I'm certainly not an expert on psychoanalytic thought, but obviously things I say take quite a bit from figures you'd think of as post-Kleinian. You mentioned Mark. Obviously, I don't take anything from somebody like Mark that's structural. So Mark's not an example of somebody who is in any way formative, even though I love Mark. So Freud, Klein to the post-Kleinians. In politics, the people who take the political seriously. So I greatly admire John Rawls, but I'm an anti-Rawlsian. And I think there might be some distinctions and names mentioned, in that ideology video on the philosophy channel. But the reason your question is important is because I should have some kind of printout for this sort of stuff that's available on my website. I'm starting an email list soon, and we'll get that done. Okay, last question, and then we're done. Okay, last one. Leader filtering idea. We'll take two questions, actually. There's a question about my health. Matty Math is asking, do you think that given your health, you could do debates online? If so, do you plan any? I'm planning a conversation or two more on the main channel, but not in a debate format. I am slow to be open to debate formats because I think they create a strange kind of equalization. Leader filtering idea. Number one, low score in dark tetrad, too high conscientiousness, 3 high. No, none of these things really are checkable, right? So if you were to introduce a criteria for politics, you'd have to make that criteria itself somehow external to the everyday contestation in politics. That's one thing I'd say. The second thing I'd say is that I don't think an IQ of 130 means anything. You could be dumb as a rock with an IQ of 145. Dumb as a rock. So it measures very little of human intelligence, an IQ test. So you need these criteria to be somehow free from contestation, and they're not going to be. And two, some of these criteria are just not good in themselves. Thank you, beautiful community. Lots of love. We're going to talk more soon. Thank you so much for being with me. Bye-bye on this occasion. Catch you later.